Caroline never expected her relationship with her nephew, Elijah, to evolve the way it had. What had always been a typical familial bond, built on support and care, shifted one quiet evening when Elijah knocked on her door, needing comfort after a rough day. Caroline, who had always been a source of strength for him, welcomed him in without a second thought. But that night, as they talked about life, something changed. The space between them felt charged with a new, unspoken energy. Elijah's casual touch on her arm lingered longer than it should have. And Caroline's heart started to race. She couldn't pinpoint why she felt this way. It wasn't like her to entertain such thoughts. He was her nephew, for heaven's sake. Yet, as Elijah's gaze held hers with an intensity she hadn't noticed before, she couldn't help but feel the stirrings of something unexpected. The chemistry between them was undeniable, even if both of them were too afraid to acknowledge it aloud. The more Caroline tried to ignore it, the stronger it seemed to grow. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. She knew that something deep inside her had changed, but she couldn't bring herself to confront the reality of it. Caroline had always prided herself on maintaining a sense of control over her emotions. But Elijah's presence in her life was starting to make that impossible. Their bond, once so simple and unspoken, began to feel different, as though a delicate line was being crossed without either of them fully acknowledging it. One evening, after a particularly tense conversation, Elijah sat beside her on the couch. The room felt too small, the air thick with unspoken words. She could feel his body heat next to hers, his breath steady but too close. Caroline fought to keep her composure, but her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm of it echoing in her ears. Elijah, as if sensing the change, hesitated, his hand brushing lightly against hers. The touch was innocent, yet it carried a weight that felt far from innocent. Caroline's mind screamed at her to move away, to put distance between them. But she remained still, caught in the electric tension between them. Elijah's eyes met hers, and for a brief, haunting moment, Caroline could see the same confusion reflected back at her. Was it just a passing feeling for him? Or had he too begun to notice the shift? Her thoughts swirled with doubt. But one thing was certain. Things would never be the same again. The days following that unsettling night were filled with a quiet tension. Caroline found herself watching Elijah with a new awareness, his every gesture and glance laden with something unspoken. Each time they passed in the hall or exchanged words, she couldn't ignore the flicker of something deeper between them, an energy that hadn't been there before. The normalcy of their daily interactions, once comforting, now felt distant, as though a barrier had quietly slipped between them. Elijah seemed to retreat, a subtle shift in his demeanor, as if he, too, sensed the change but didn't know how to address it. Caroline tried to focus on the mundane, making breakfast, answering emails, handling household chores, but her mind kept drifting, returning to those moments, the weight of his hand brushing hers, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. It unsettled her, but there was also a magnetic pull she couldn't deny. She tried to convince herself it was just a fleeting moment, that she was overthinking it. But deep down, Caroline knew better. Something had shifted irrevocably. There was no turning back now, and the weight of the choice ahead hung heavy in her mind. What if everything she had built, every relationship she held dear, was suddenly teetering on the edge of this unspoken truth? Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing between her and Elijah. A current of tension that neither of them could fully acknowledge but both clearly felt. It started innocently, enough small moments where their eyes met just a beat too long, where their casual conversations seemed to carry an undertone of something deeper. But the more time passed, the more it became impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the physical proximity, or the stolen glances, but the subtle shifts in the air around them. The warmth of his presence seemed to fill the spaces between them, drawing her in, and yet pushing her away all at once. Caroline, for the first time in years, felt alive in a way that terrified her. The chaos of emotions stirred within her, a dangerous mix of guilt and excitement that twisted her thoughts into knots. She loved her husband, Thomas, she was sure of that, but Elijah's youthful energy, his intensity, it was like a drug she couldn't resist. Every time he entered a room, it was as if the world grew smaller, the weight of the unspoken growing heavier. And yet, as much as she tried to distance herself from him, part of her knew the tension would inevitably snap, and the consequences would be far-reaching. What would she do when the line between motherly concern and forbidden desire became impossible to distinguish? The tension between Caroline and Elijah had escalated to an unbearable point. But she couldn't bring herself to stop it. Each time they were alone, the weight of their unspoken connection seemed to press in around her. Suffocating yet intoxicating, it was like a magnet pulling them closer with every passing day. Caroline had never intended for this to happen. It was supposed to be simple. Elijah was her nephew, and she was supposed to be a safe, nurturing figure in his life. But somewhere along the way, the lines blurred, and now she found herself in a spiral of emotions she couldn't control. What had started as a simple familial bond had transformed into something dangerous. Something she couldn't ignore, even if she tried. Elijah's presence was electric, his gaze always lingering just a little longer than it should. Caroline had always prided herself on her ability to handle any situation. But this was beyond her. Her love for Thomas, her husband, was unwavering, but the pull she felt toward Elijah, his raw intensity and the closeness between them left her questioning everything. Each moment with him felt like a stolen secret, and she couldn't help but wonder, how far could they go before it was too late? Caroline couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, the image of Elijah lingered in her mind. His touch, his gaze, all those moments she tried to push away but couldn't. It was wrong. She knew it. He was her nephew, the boy she'd watched grow up. Yet, there was something in the air between them that couldn't be ignored. Something undeniable that both terrified and thrilled her. The tension had been building for weeks, small touches, lingering looks, moments of accidental closeness, and now it had reached a boiling point. Caroline's heart pounded just thinking about it. Her relationship with Thomas had always been steady, but something had shifted in her. A hunger she couldn't quiet, a longing she hadn't felt in years. She had tried to keep her distance, tried to maintain the boundaries she'd set, but Elijah's presence had become impossible to escape. His warmth, his closeness, made her feel alive in a way she hadn't realized she was missing. Caroline squeezed her eyes shut, willing the thoughts to stop, to go away, but they didn't. She couldn't deny the pull she felt toward him anymore, nor could she ignore the guilt that haunted her. The question burned in her chest, was this just a fleeting moment? Or had something irreversible begun? Caroline couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of dread hanging over her as she walked through the quiet house. Elijah's words echoed in her mind, haunting her with their intensity. "I can't stop thinking about you." The weight of his confession settled in her chest, squeezing out any semblance of calm. She knew she should have been outraged, maybe even disgusted, but instead, her heart had raced in response to his words, a heat rising within her that she couldn't suppress. The line between aunt and nephew had blurred in a way that left her breathless. Unsure of how to move forward, she tried to shake off the feeling, to dismiss it as some temporary lapse. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Every time Elijah was near, every time their eyes met, it felt like they were both standing on the edge of something they couldn't control. Something dangerous. She had spent so many years building a life with Thomas, believing she was in control, believing her boundaries were clear. But Elijah had broken through those walls without even trying. Caroline thought about her marriage, how it had grown cold over the years, how she had been yearning for something more. But was this it? Was this the change she had been seeking? The thought both thrilled and terrified her. The tension between Caroline and Elijah was undeniable, thick in the air as they sat in the living room, their proximity making every breath seem louder. Caroline could feel her heart thudding in her chest, each beat reminding her of the complexity of the situation. Elijah's presence had always been a comfort, a constant in her life as her nephew. But now, every glance, every word, felt charged with something deeper, something she didn't fully understand. He had been a boy she raised, someone she loved like her own. And yet here they were, standing on the precipice of something dangerous. Caroline's thoughts swirled, confusion and guilt battling with something more primal she didn't want to acknowledge. She had lived in a world where everything had its place: Thomas, Elijah, herself, until the lines blurred. The affection she felt for Elijah wasn't just familial anymore. It was different, forbidden even. She couldn't help but wonder if the quiet loneliness she had been battling in her marriage had made her more vulnerable to these feelings. Each time Elijah moved closer, it became harder to pretend nothing had changed. The distance between them had disappeared long ago. Caroline had always believed that love had boundaries. But now, sitting in the quiet with Elijah, those boundaries felt like fragile threads ready to snap under the weight of their unspoken desires. Caroline felt the weight of Elijah's words sink into her chest, each syllable an echo of something that couldn't be unsaid. His confession, soft and vulnerable, hung in the air between them. She had always known Elijah as the curious boy who had grown up in her care. But now his gaze, intense and questioning, made her feel like an entirely different person. The flood of emotions that surged through her was overwhelming: fear, guilt, and an undeniable pull that she couldn't explain. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was just a moment of weakness, that this was not real, that nothing would come of it. But Elijah's presence, the way he looked at her, was too much. It felt like the air had thickened, pressing in around her, trapping her in a moment that neither of them could escape. Caroline stood frozen, not knowing whether to step back or to give in to the overwhelming force that seemed to be pulling them together. This was wrong. She knew it, but the longer they sat there, the harder it was to fight the desire. The confusion, the raw, vulnerable connection she had never allowed herself to feel. What was this? What was happening between them? How could something so wrong feel so right? The days following that night felt like an endless storm to Caroline. Each time she looked at Elijah, it was as if the tension between them thickened, leaving a palpable, uncomfortable air that neither of them could escape. She wanted to pretend nothing had changed, to keep living her life as she always had, but everything felt different now. She avoided his gaze when they passed each other in the hall, her heart pounding whenever he came too close. The subtle glances, the way his words lingered, seemed to pull her deeper into a web she never meant to weave. She had always thought she understood her relationship with Elijah. He was her nephew, her responsibility, her family, but now, each interaction was laced with a complexity that left her questioning everything. It wasn't just the moments when they were alone together. It was the quiet that filled the spaces in between, the unspoken words that hung heavy in the air. Caroline was trapped between the love and care she had always felt for him, and the confusion and guilt that had begun to consume her thoughts. She knew she couldn't ignore it forever, but confronting the truth meant facing a reality she wasn't ready to acknowledge. In today's world, we often find ourselves caught in complicated, emotional situations that blur the lines between right and wrong. It's essential to recognize when something feels off and take a step back before letting it spiral. Communication, honesty, and boundaries are crucial in maintaining healthy relationships, whether with family, friends, or partners. When faced with difficult emotions, it's important to pause, reflect, and talk things through with someone who can provide perspective. Always trust your instincts, but remember that taking responsibility for your actions and seeking support can help prevent situations from becoming overwhelming or damaging.